Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the UK's former health minister is being ridiculed and condemned by the British public and by his fellow MPs for joining a reality show with a fee of nearly £500,000. Bereaved COVID-19 victims have called his decision a disgrace. I'll be discussing the implications with our business correspondent Simon Pusey, and we are getting dangerously closer to the point of no return. That was a stark message from the UN Secretary-General to world leaders at COP27. Climate activist and self-proclaimed eco-feminist Adenike Oladoshu will be joining me from Egypt with her assessment of the ongoing talks. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with a story that continues to make headlines here in the UK. I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. If you're not familiar with the popular reality TV show, you soon could be, as one of its participants is the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. The British parliamentarian has reportedly been paid £400,000 by TV producers to appear on the TV show, which is notable for humiliating celebrities with bizarre eating challenges. The MP's highly controversial appearance has once again raised questions about the competence of the Conservative Party.
I've been very clear that I was very disappointed with the decision he made. I think there's lots for us all to be getting on with at this time, and that's what I think people should be focused on.
Well, earlier I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for more on this story. Simon, there's a bit of a throwback to the Johnsonian era because personality politics has dominated Downing Street discourse. We've got to start with Matt Hancock, former Health Secretary, very, very popular in the United Kingdom, or should I say infamous, because of course he was on our TV screens most nights updating us on those dreadful COVID deaths. He is now in an ITV series called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and it's not gone down well at all, has it?
Yeah, so for viewers who don't know this show, it's a kind of Big Brother type thing. It's not aired 24/7 like Big Brother is, but it's that kind of thing where the camera's always rolling and you've got a bunch of celebrities. They're all quite highly paid, and this is controversial because obviously he's a sitting MP. He's had the whip withdrawn from the Conservative Party. That means he's no longer a Conservative Party member. He no longer stands for the Conservative Party because he has left basically his constituents to go and be on this TV show for however many weeks he's going to be on. And so that's caused quite a lot of controversy. And of course, he was the Health Secretary during the pandemic, so he was making a lot of life and death decisions, really. And a lot of people blame him for the increase in deaths that we saw, and a lot of people blame him. You can't win in that situation. A lot of people said he went too far. A lot of people said he didn't go far enough.
Yeah. Care homes in particular.
Care homes, yeah, exactly, when the pandemic sort of ran rampant through that. And so there were people on the show who were a bit uncomfortable saying, you know, my mum was on life support. If she died at that point, I don't think I could stay on this show. So there's a lot of controversy there. I think he's doing it to say that he wants to show that politicians have, you know, a personality and they're not just robotic. He says he wants to sort of talk about dyslexia on the show and, you know, highlight things that he thinks needs to be talked about. But I think it's really hard to excuse. And, you know, him being on there is funny from one perspective because he is a bit of a geek. He is, you know, it's funny to sort of laugh at him, and then obviously people can give him trials and get to see him sort of eating bugs and things like that. But I think on a serious note, I think, yeah, for a paid politician to go off and take hundreds of thousands of pounds to mess around in a jungle, a lot of people would say that's, whether he's Health Secretary or not, or former Health Secretary, that's just not on, really. And so I think...
Yeah, it's in poor taste, isn't it? Let's talk about Gavin Williamson, you know, master of the dark arts, as they said. He's handed in his resignation letter. Again, it's about personalities and the choice of who Rishi Sunak would put in his top cabinet. How's that gone?
Well, I think it shows just how factious the Conservative Party is, and this kind of game that Rishi Sunak is trying to play to try and keep all of these different sides together, that he's hiring people like Suella Braverman and Gavin Williamson to the cabinet, means that he's not doing this probably through choice. He's not thinking Gavin Williamson's the best person for this job. He didn't even have a title in cabinet. He was just sitting in cabinet. But then it's come out that he's sent all of these threatening messages, and people are accusing him of bullying. And this is the third time, right, that he's either been fired or sacked. So it's not his first offence. Yeah, I think that just shows really the kind of very difficult game that Rishi Sunak needs to play to try and keep the cabinet and the Conservative Party together, which everyone said it was going to be such a hard ask. But of course, only a couple of weeks into the job as Prime Minister, he's had to let one of his people go pretty much. I don't think it was probably his decision to resign. It was probably Rishi Sunak saying you have to. And then you've got Suella Braverman, a lot of people talking about her and her policies and the use of her language, talking about migrants invading. And so it's not looking good for Rishi Sunak on that front, because, yeah, you don't want someone resigning in the first few weeks of your premiership. And, yeah, people talking about his judgment in terms of hiring him, because these things, you know, he probably knew about, or he knew the kind of nature of the allegations against him before he hired him. So I think lots of Sir Keir Starmer is jumping on this and saying, well,
he's weak. Yeah,
exactly. He's weak. He can't stand up to a bully. And yeah, you know, what kind of example does that give to people around the country if you've got someone right at the top of government who's behaving in this way? So not an easy start for Rishi Sunak, not a great start. But yeah, again, we're talking about personalities, aren't we? And this is unfortunately the way politics works. It's not all about policy. Often it's much more entertaining to talk about Matt Hancock being in the jungle and Gavin Williamson flying around sending these text messages. So yeah, not great for the Conservatives at the moment, but compared to the last couple of months with Boris and with Liz Truss, it's actually quite calm waters compared to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, let's see if it's still calm next week. Thank you, Simon. Now to our next topic. It appears so far as if the Democrats' worst fears have not materialised in the high-stakes US midterms, as President Joe Biden's party held on to key battlegrounds. It is thought that the results so far could take the wind out of Donald Trump's hopes for a second term. The former president had endorsed more than 300 candidates and had hopes that their victories could be used as a springboard for a 2024 presidential campaign. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by author and activist Yaron Brook. Yaron joins me from Akron City in Ohio. For those of us who don't follow or who struggle to follow the midterms, can you just explain what these results mean for Biden, for Trump and for ordinary Americans?
Sure. I mean, I think that overall the results are good for the Democrats. Usually what happens in the United States is in a midterm, the party that is not in power usually does very, very well. They usually overwhelm the party in power. So the expectation was, you probably heard of a red wave, a red tsunami. The expectation was the Republicans would sweep in, take large majorities in the House, and take the Senate. None of that happened. While the Republicans did okay, they have taken control of the House. The Senate, we still don't know. We'll find out. This big red wave never materialized, and of course, everybody is wondering. You know, the big question, of course, is why. But what it means for Biden is that he hasn't been completely repudiated, although he's still very unpopular in the U.S. But what it means is the next 2 years are going to be difficult for him. That is, he's going to have to deal with a majority of Republicans in the House who are not going to want to cooperate with him much. It means it all depends, of course, what happens in the Senate. Right now, the Senate is 50-50, which favors the Democrats, because in the United States, when the Senate is 50-50, the vice president votes to make a tie. So if it stays 50-50, then he still has some control over the Senate, which is favorable, because while he can't get a lot of legislation passed without the House, the Senate does certain things that the House, they doesn't need the House for example, judicial appointments. But if the Republicans take the Senate, if they get 51 votes, 51 seats, which is still possible, then the Biden agenda, of course, becomes more difficult, particularly at the legislative level, and then the appointment of judges.
Yes, I know Biden, he'll be 80 in a couple of days. I did hear a couple of, I'm no ageist, Yaron, as well, but I'm not sure him declaring that he plans to run again has gone down too well. But let's move on from Biden and talk about Donald Trump, shall we? Sure. The Economist said that he remains a big net drag on the Republican Party. Do you agree?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think he's a drag on the Republican Party. Look, Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and at the time, he had a Republican majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House. Since then, in 2018, they lost the House. Then in 2020, Donald Trump lost the presidency and lost the Senate. And now, instead of a red wave and a red tsunami, it's been a very lackluster performance by Republicans. And a lot of that, I think, is a consequence of Donald Trump's election, denying the results of the 2020 election, selecting candidates that support his denial, selecting candidates that support his style of governance, that stand really for nothing, that are unprincipled. So I think the election, the midterm election, would definitely represent the drag that Trump continues to have on the support the Republican Party gets. Most Americans don't like what Trump is making of the Republican Party. And now the big question is going to be, is Trump going to announce he's running for president in spite of what pretty much everybody views as a defeat in the midterms, or is he going to step down and allow for other rising candidates to take over kind of the leadership of the Republican Party?
We'll just have to wait and see. As they say in politics, we've got our own stuff going on here in Britain, but not quite as colourful as what's happening in the States at the moment. Yaron Brook, author and chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's remain with our focus on the outcome of the American midterm elections. For more insight, I'm now being joined by an Assistant District Attorney, Pamela Ibe. Pamela joins me from the city of Kuntz in Hardin County, Texas. Pamela Ibe, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global from Kuntz City in Texas. The Republicans have underperformed during these midterms. But in your state, quite surprisingly for some, Greg Abbott has won re-election for a third term. What has been the reaction?
Oh, thank you for having me. The reaction is mixed, actually, depending on who you talk to. But it wasn't unexpected. You know, Texas is a deep red state. And so the issues that sway voters somewhere else may not do much for Texas. So it wasn't really a surprise. Yeah. It was kind of expected.
Pamela, let's zoom out a little bit and look at America on the whole. America is such a dichotomy. On the one hand, the world is pretty much Americanized, right? You know, we watch all of your movies, we consume so much of your goods. But on the other hand, when it comes to politics, unless you are a seasoned political observer, it is very difficult to understand, which is why it's great that we can speak to American Nigerians like you to get your viewpoint. Is the nation still very bitterly divided? There was supposed to be a red sweep for the Republicans. It hasn't happened. Do you think people are now starting to kind of move away from the conspiracy theories about a stolen election, or is that narrative still very strong? Because Biden has done pretty well this week, hasn't he?
He has. But you know what? The country is still very much divided. There's still the real threat to democracy. Yeah. Those conspiracy theories are still very strong. But in this election, there were issues that really mattered to most of the country. Maybe Texas doesn't show that, but in most of the country, all that's going on with the laws, like abortion rights, with all that's going on, the rest of the country decided to make a statement, but the country is still very deeply divided. And it's a real threat.
Pamela Ibe, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Pam. In a moment, I'll be discussing climate change loss and damage reparations with environmentalist Adenike Oladosu. But until then, here's a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week. Next week, the 5th Nigerian Diaspora Investment Summit will take place in Abuja over 3 days, bringing together investors from across the world to engage with the country's public and private sector.
The idea is to showcase investment opportunities in Nigeria, particularly those that involve small businesses and startups. As you know, the startup sector is a fast growth sector in in Nigeria, in Africa as a whole, particularly in Nigeria.
The revamped Twitter Blue service is now live in the UK. Until now, the verification badge was only given to notable or high-profile accounts, which Twitter had analysed and deemed authentic. But from now on, users will be verified by paying a £6.99 monthly subscription. Currently, only users on Apple's iOS system can sign up to the service, but the company said Twitter Blue would expand to Android users and the web version of the platform in due course. According to media reports, Adidas will rebrand Yeezy products in order to continue selling them without Kanye West. Last month, the German sportswear brand was forced to terminate its partnership with the rapper over his anti-Semitic remarks on social media. The contract was worth an estimated $1.5 billion. During a call to discuss quarterly earnings, bosses said the brand is the sole owner of certain design rights and intended to make use of them in the coming months. Kanye West's offensive comments have cost him a slew of business deals, which include American fashion chain Gap and luxury designer Balenciaga. Now to our final topic. Much of the talks at the start of the COP27 meeting in the Egyptian resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh have been consumed by one of the most protracted, divisive and confusing issues ever to arise in these negotiations: loss and damage. The idea first emerged 3 decades ago in places where lives and livelihoods were most at risk from rising sea levels and vicious storms. These small island nations began to call for measures such as an international insurance system or a global fund bankrolled by richer countries to help cover such losses. Recognition of this issue in the Paris Agreement was a key outcome for vulnerable developing countries. Nevertheless, not all of the parties' underlying concerns are resolved with the inclusion of Article 8 in the legally binding treaty. Some of the options being discussed during the climate change conference include adaptation financing. It is widely agreed that more investment is needed in systems that are affected by climate change, systems that produce food, and that more protection is needed to manage water and the natural environment. Mitigation financing will enable the use of new technologies and renewable energies, making older equipment more energy efficient or changing management practices or consumer behaviour. Another alternative is direct payments from richer nations to the developing world, which has so far been met with fierce resistance. Why? Because according to the African Development Bank, the continent will need around $1.6 trillion in climate financing between 2022 and 2030. These figures are terrifying for world leaders who are suffering significant domestic economic turmoil due to high gas prices and high inflation, which has been fueled by the war in Ukraine. Climate activist and self-proclaimed eco-feminist Adenike Oladosu has been present at many of these discussions taking place at the conference, and she joins me now from Sharm el-Sheikh. Adenike Oladosu, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Talk to me about what the atmosphere is like in Sharm el-Sheikh and what you're hoping will be achieved when these climate talks wrap up next week.
Okay, so very well. Thank you. I'm currently at COP27, just as we spoke at COP26. I'm hoping that world leaders try to divert from fossil fuel or opening of coal plants into sustainable development goals, such as solar and other renewable sources of energy that could help to drive climate justice and help to solve the defining issue of our time, because the climate change crisis is leading to loss and damage, security issue, conflict, and the rest. And I feel like there's a sense of responsibility to see that we try to fund the loss and damage, because the loss and damage is like a morality check from the developed country to see how we could meet our demand or how they could be responsible for action of emitting the most. And that is what matters most to see how we could channel finance towards adaptation mitigation. So I want to see real-time actions beyond just promises into the reality of what is on ground about the climate change crisis.
Thank you, Adenike, for mentioning loss and damage, because that has been a big talking point. Well, it was at least earlier this week on World Leaders' Day, though, as to be expected, because of domestic internal issues that world leaders are facing, they're pretty scared about pledging or, saying that they will contribute to that $100 billion every single year. Are you expecting more from African leaders? Do you want them to be lobbying harder, on the sidelines, in the hotels, during lunch, to ensure that they can walk away with some reparations for their communities who so desperately need it?
Okay, very well. We have seen that in COP, there have been some financial commitments from Western countries, but those commitments are below what is needed right now to deal with this loss and damage crisis. So we know what happened in Nigeria concerning the flood, that out of 36 states, 33 were affected by the flood crisis. We are seeing such also in the northeastern part of Africa. We are seeing it around the globe. And those commitments, those financial commitments, so low or so small to deal with the loss and damage, because those loss and damage are going to billions of dollars, and in 2030 it's worth trillions of dollars. So it's really a slow commitment and need a fast, rapid way of how to transform our society. But first, we have to quit fossil fuel, which is one of the bases or the root cause of the climate change crisis, and not to come up with a carbon credit to see how polluters could buy their way out and keep emitting. So loss and damage is at the center of it all, and we don't just want it to just be something that we just talk about. We want real-time actions that beyond the financial commitment. We don't want commitments of what happened in the $100 billion annual commitment that was not fulfilled. All of those financial commitments, they have to have a framework of how to get to the most vulnerable countries like Nigeria and other countries that are being hit by the greatest impact of climate change crisis, that this loss and damage is even beyond monetary terms, because when people lost their cultures, natural heritage, natural sites, lives, you can't bring them back. It becomes permanently and can never be replaced nor restored. And so before it becomes lost, we have to take actions, which I hope that developed country should have conscience in dealing with the climate change crisis.
You're absolutely right. I completely agree with everything you just said there. And, I think the African Development Bank have said Africa would be owed about $1 trillion by 2050. And we know Antonio Guterres, we heard from him at the start of the week, didn't he, saying that, this climate crisis is also fueling insecurity and conflicts, no less than in Nigeria. I want to talk to you about Nigeria. You are, of course, Nigerian. And I want to ask, in country, do you think the climate emergency, aside the flooding, we have seen those devastating pictures, is the urgency of the crisis trickling through to ordinary Nigerians, do you think?
I think one of those initiatives that I am involved, which is going to take place on the 12th of Saturday at COP27, which I'm going to be addressing at the COP presidency room, of which I was invited to address, is the launch of the initiative, which will be the first initiative that the COP presidency or the COP in general will launch on climate security, will be on climate resiliency or sustaining peace. And I feel like that initiative talks about our current reality of how climate change is leading to conflict, not just limited to just failure or food insecurity or the rest. We are now seeing climate change in different dimensions. That is not a single crisis, but a multiple crisis.
Adenike Oladosu, climate activist and self-proclaimed eco-feminist. I do love that terminology. Thank you so much for joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you, Adenike.
Thank you so much, too.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.